Hello, and thank you for choosing this full-length, clean, historical Western romance by Kat Lynn. We are so happy to have you with us today. Before we begin, don't forget to tap the subscribe button and like and share with your friends. Your support allows us to continue sharing these sweet, heartwarming stories for free. Now, relax and get ready to travel back in time to the American frontier, where we join an adventure to find love and happily ever after. Enjoy. Copyright of Kat Lynn. Wagon Train Brides, Book 8. Elizabeth by Kat Lynn, Chapter 1. Kansas City, Missouri, 1875. Elizabeth stood shivering in the early morning cold on the pavement next to the place she'd called home for the past 8 years, tears streaming down her face. She clutched her small suitcase closer to her chest and began walking down the street. She had no idea where she was going, but she couldn't as well stand on the path for the rest of the day. Had she known that she would be thrown out on the street like this, she would have never agreed to leave the orphanage. At least there, she'd had a warm place to sleep and food to eat. Independence, Missouri, 1865. 5-year-old Elizabeth woke up groggy, hungry, and wanting breakfast to find her house full of their neighbors. She'd searched around for her mother, but she couldn't find her anywhere. Everyone in the house was looking at her strangely, and she couldn't figure out why. She just wanted her mother. "Mrs. Firth, where is my mama?" she'd finally asked her next-door neighbor. "Oh, you poor darling, your mama is in heaven now," the older lady replied as a single tear made its way down her cheek. "I'm hungry. When is she coming back?" Elizabeth had asked as she stuck a thumb in her mouth and rubbed her rumbling tummy with the other hand. In her 5-year-old mind, she wondered how far heaven was and whether her mama would be back soon enough to prepare for Elizabeth her favorite breakfast. "She's not coming back, dear, but I can prepare something for you to eat," Mrs. Firth answered. She rushed into the kitchen and began fumbling about by the stove. She had no idea how to explain the situation to the child. That evening, Elizabeth had gone to Mrs. Firth's house with all her clothes in a suitcase. A couple of days later, a serious-looking man and woman had arrived at Mrs. Firth's house, and after spending a considerable amount of time speaking with Mrs. Firth in the drawing room, they'd called Elizabeth into the room. "Elizabeth, this here is Mr. and Mrs. Blake. You'll be going home with them," Mrs. Firth said, confusing Elizabeth even further. "Will my mama come for me later?" Elizabeth had asked after a brief silence. "No, dear. Remember what I told you? Your mama is in heaven now, and she's not coming back," Mrs. Firth said, holding the child's little hands in hers. She hated seeing her go, but at her age, she wasn't in a position to take care of a child. "Don't worry, Elizabeth. Mr. Blake and I will take good care of you." Mrs. Blake spoke for the first time, and Elizabeth immediately liked her. She had a warm smile and a kind face, and Elizabeth felt comfortable with her. "There are other kids at home for you to play with." "Okay," Elizabeth said. If her mama wasn't coming back, then she might as well live with the Blakes. 2 years passed, and as she grew older, Elizabeth began to realize that Mr. and Mrs. Blake were only taking care of them because they were all orphans. It slowly dawned on her that her mother had died that awful morning and that she was never going to see her again. One morning after breakfast, Elizabeth was summoned into Mrs. Blake's office, and when she got there, she found a strange woman seated with Mrs. Blake. "Elizabeth, I'd like you to meet someone," Mrs. Blake started, and before Elizabeth could utter a word, the strange woman rose and engulfed her in a big hug. "You're so beautiful, dear. You look exactly like my brother," she exclaimed as she hugged Elizabeth even tighter. Shocked, Elizabeth pulled away and stepped back. "Pardon me, ma'am, but who are you?" Elizabeth asked, and the woman smiled. Her eyes seemed cold, and Elizabeth didn't smile back. "I'm your Aunt Norma, your father's younger sister," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't look for you earlier, but I'm here now." "Elizabeth, please have a seat, and Mrs. Norma will explain to you why she's here," Mrs. Blake said calmly, but Elizabeth's mind was racing. Who was this lady? She'd never met her father, and her mother had never mentioned him ever having a sister. What was going on? "I heard that your mother passed away and left you an orphan, and that you now live in an orphanage. I was saddened by the news. My brother must be turning in his grave. No family of mine will live in an orphanage if I can help it. I want to take you home with me, Norma said. What about school? I was about to start. Mrs. Blake? Elizabeth pleaded with her eyes on Mrs. Blake, but Norma quickly stepped in. Don't worry about that, Elizabeth. I will make sure you go to school, Norma said, and Mrs. Blake nodded her agreement. Elizabeth gave up. That afternoon, Elizabeth bid farewell to her foster siblings and left Independence for Kansas City with Aunt Norma. Now, as she walked down the street, cold and in tears, she wished she'd never left Mrs. Blake's house. Her aunt had used Elizabeth's name and sold her parents' home in Independence. She'd squandered all the money without ever taking Elizabeth to school. Now she'd thrown her out of her house, and it was by sheer luck that she'd allowed Elizabeth to pack up her few belongings. But as much as being thrown out to the streets hurt Elizabeth, she was relieved that her aunt would never mistreat her again. She was now 15 years old, almost turning 16 years old, and she prayed that someone would give her a job, no matter how menial it was. She had no idea where she would sleep that night or the next. She remembered her life with her mother, and a fresh torrent of tears began to fall. Why had her mother left her alone? She wished she could have gone with her. She thought of going to Independence to look for Mrs. Blake, but so many years had passed, and she wasn't sure whether Mrs. Blake was still alive or not. She truly was lost. Chapter 2. Lincoln, Nebraska, 1880. Arthur Rogers sat in his office closely inspecting his business records, and he instantly realized that something wasn't right. He'd been suspecting that his boarding house manager, Chuck Willis, had been ripping him off for quite some time now. It saddened him that a boy that he had picked up from the streets, fed and clothed before teaching him about the business, would be the one to betray him like this. He shook with rage. At 40 years of age, Arthur had a long time ago decided that he would never get married after witnessing how his father had suffered after his mother ran away with another man. He'd hoped to groom Chuck as his heir, but after what he'd discovered, that would no longer be possible. He hoped to confront the young man as soon as he reported for work. As if on cue, Chuck walked into the office with a wide smile on his face. It soon disappeared when he saw the expression on Arthur's face. "Mr. Rogers, you came in early today," he said, his eyes falling on the records spread out on Arthur's desk. "Skip the pleasantries, Chuck. There is a matter we urgently need to discuss," Arthur said as he pointed him to a seat. "Is something the matter, Mr. Rogers?" Chuck asked, and Arthur could sense the panic in his voice. "We're about to find out, aren't we?" Arthur replied as he pushed the records toward Chuck and pointed at a column. "Can you explain this discrepancy to me, Chuck?" "Mr. Rogers, I was going to tell you about it," Chuck began, but Arthur stopped him in his tracks. "You and I know that isn't true. Had I not found out, you'd have gotten away with it," Arthur said. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rogers. I will pay you back every penny, I promise," Chuck pleaded. "Why would you do this to me, Chuck? If you were having money problems, you could have come to me," he said. "I realize that now, sir. Please give me another chance," Chuck begged, but Arthur wasn't ready to hear it. "I can no longer trust you, Chuck, and as such, I can't continue working with you. Please pack your belongings and leave the boarding house by the end of the day today," Arthur said without looking at Chuck. "Where will I go? I have no one else but you, sir," cried Chuck. "You should have thought about that before you stole from me." "I'm sure you have enough to afford some kind of accommodation," Arthur said. "Please don't do this to me, sir. I will never steal from you again," Chuck said, but Arthur had had enough. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, son. Let this be a lesson to you in the future," Arthur said with finality, and Chuck knew that his goose was cooked. "Okay, I will leave, but you will be sorry that you did this to me." Chuck exclaimed, his demeanor suddenly changed. As he got up from his seat, his eyes looked wild, and Arthur was shocked. "Is that a threat, Chuck?" he asked. "No, sir, it's a promise," Chuck retorted. He then turned and walked out of the office, banging the door violently behind him. It was then that Arthur realized that he'd just dodged a bullet. Chuck would have brought his business to its knees had Arthur not found out what he'd been up to. He couldn't believe how ungrateful Chuck had turned out to be. Thankfully, that chapter was over and done with. Arthur was quietly enjoying his mug of ale at the local salon when someone slapped him hard on the back. He angrily turned around, thinking it was a drunk, but to his surprise, it was his longtime friend, Chad Pointer. "Howdy, Art. What brings you here at this late hour?" Chad asked, as he pulled a stool and sat down next to his friend. "Ah, Chad, I'm here, drowning my sorrows is all," he replied, and Chad noticed Arthur did look a bit worn out. "Out with it, Art. A problem shared is a problem half solved," Chad bellowed as he waved the bartender over. "Bring this man another mug, and one for me as well." As they drank, Arthur narrated the entire incident to his friend, and Chad was itching to speak before Arthur was done talking. He was particularly irked that Chuck dared to threaten Arthur after everything he'd done for him. "I'd warned you about that boy, but you didn't listen to me. He had an evil aura about him," Chad said. "I agree. I saw that look in his eyes today. I should have listened to you back then, but my heart had gone out to him then." "I really did want to help him," Arthur agreed. "He wasn't worth your salt after all." "Let's forget about him," Chad advised, but he could see that Arthur's mind was far away. "What's on your mind now, Art?" "It's going to be very hard to run the boarding house by myself," he said. "Why don't you get married? That way you kill two birds with one stone. You get a wife and someone to help run the boarding house," Chad said, and Arthur laughed. "Get married? To whom? This town holds no prospects that I can see," he answered, still amused by the whole idea. "She doesn't have to be from here," Chad went on. "I have no desire to get married, but even if I did, where would I get this bride from?" he asked. "A mail-order bride," Chad said, and turned his eyes to his ale. Arthur had thought his friend was joking, but it was fast dawning on him that he wasn't. "A what?" he asked. "You heard me the first time," Chad replied, his eyes firmly on his half-empty mug. Chapter 3. Kansas City, Missouri, 1880. Elizabeth walked to the tiny window in her room at the boarding house and stared at the streets down below. There were people milling around as they hurried to close down their businesses and go home for the night. She wondered how it felt like to leave work and go home. Since she'd started working at the boarding house, it was the only life she'd known. The owner had been kind enough to offer her a room where she'd been sleeping while she worked there. She would remember how happy she'd been at Mrs. Blake's house with the other children, and she would be overcome with sadness. It was now 5 years since she'd started working at the boarding house, and she would wonder if this was all life had to offer her. Every now and then she would think about her aunt, but she had no desire to ever see or hear from her again. She couldn't understand how her aunt would claim to have loved her brother, and yet she'd treated his child with such disdain. It would have been very easy for her aunt to find out where Elizabeth lived, but it was obvious that the evil woman didn't care to know. It didn't matter, Elizabeth thought. She was 20 years old now, and she no longer needed her aunt. That night, as she lay in her bed, Elizabeth thought about her mother and the day she died, leaving her alone. She'd only been 5 years old then, and now she could fully understand why the neighbors were all staring at her with sadness. They must have known how hard life would be for her without a parent. A huge lump grew in her throat, and she swallowed hard. She couldn't allow herself to break down anymore. It never did her any good. She must have fallen asleep because when she startled awake, bright light was streaming in through the old glass windows, and someone was knocking loudly at the door. She hastily threw a shawl over her shoulders and went to see who it was, hoping it wasn't her boss. It then occurred to her that she had the day off. Who was then knocking so impatiently? She wondered. To her delight, it was June, the washer lady. She was the only one who cared for Elizabeth, and they got on well together. She motioned for her to come in, and she closed the door behind them. "June, good morning. What brings you to my room?" she asked as June went to sit by her side on the bed. "Good morning, Elizabeth. I bring you the most wonderful news," June replied, grinning from ear to ear. "What news, June? Nothing interesting happens inside this building," Elizabeth replied, thinking that June was only joking with her. "Do you remember you told me that you'd want to find a job someplace else?" June asked. Yes, I do. Why? Have you found me a place? Elizabeth asked, now eager to hear what June had to say. I just might have, but I don't know if you'll accept it, June said. What's it about? Come on, June, tell me more, Elizabeth gushed. There's a wealthy lady who wants a house servant at her home. I think you should jump at the chance. I would have, but my husband would never allow me to work as a house servant, June said, and she looked truly sad. That sounds like a great idea. I would love to leave this place after all these years, Elizabeth answered. Well, in that case, you should meet her at the cafe at noon, and you can discuss the details. I already told her I had someone in mind. I'm sure she will like you, June reassured her. Of course, I'll be there. This is exactly what I need, Elizabeth answered. She could already picture herself working at the house. Very well. Best be there before that time to avoid being late. I doubt she'll take kindly to tardiness. Let me know how it goes, June said, as she rose and walked out of the room, leaving an excited Elizabeth fumbling around in her suitcase, looking for what she'd wear to the meeting. Prosody rate percent. I got the job, June, Elizabeth exclaimed to her friend. I knew she would like you as soon as she set her eyes on you, June said as she stopped what she was doing and walked closer to her friend. She seemed pleasant enough. I know we will get along well, Elizabeth said, and June smiled. I don't know if you can say Mrs. Jones is pleasant, but you're going there to work and not to be her friend, June said, and immediately saw the reaction on Elizabeth's face. So she's not a nice lady? She asked. I didn't say that. You know what? Forget I ever said anything. When do you start? June asked. Next week, and I can hardly wait, Elizabeth gushed, her earlier misgivings forgotten. I'll let my boss know that I will be leaving tomorrow. Okay, I hope everything works out for you. I really do, June said, realizing that she would miss seeing Elizabeth around. The rest of the week flew by as Elizabeth daydreamed about working for Mrs. Jones. She hoped this would be the beginning of the best chapter of her life. Her boss at the boarding house had tried to dissuade her from leaving, but Elizabeth's mind was already made up. He had grown very fond of the girl, and he felt like he was losing his own daughter. Elizabeth woke up early on the day she was leaving for Mrs. Jones and spent the better part of the morning bidding farewell to her fellow workers, some of whom had been with her for the past 5 years. She was sad to leave, but it was time. Chapter 4. Arthur looked around his small office and decided that everything was where it should be. It had been a month since he'd let Chuck go, and the pressure of making sure that the boarding house was running smoothly was beginning to weigh down on him. He needed help, but he couldn't see anyone around town that was good enough to take Chuck's place. His mind went back to what his friend Chad had said that evening at the salon. It sounded like a good idea, but he still wasn't comfortable with the fact that he would have to be married as well. He was already 40 years old, and he was afraid that he would only be able to attract old maids or desperate ladies who were already down on their luck. He would also have to train the person on how the business was run, and he didn't think he had the patience to do so. But what other options did he have? Try as he did, Chad's suggestion sounded like the best option. Mr. Rogers, do you have a minute? A voice asked from the doorway, startling Arthur from his trail of thoughts. Yes, Rhonda, please come in, he answered, and the young lady shuffled inside, her hands behind her back. I'm sorry, sir, but we have another problem, she began, but then paused, and Arthur motioned for her to continue with her complaint. Another one of the cleaning ladies has left. She says she's traveling out of town to get married, but I don't think so. What are we going to do now? I can't clean all the rooms by myself. Are you sure she didn't tell you the real reason she left? You know you can talk to me, Rhonda, about anything, Arthur said, sensing that she knew more than she was letting on. Well, sir, if you insist, she said, wriggling her hands together nervously, and Arthur knew that his suspicions were true. She knew exactly why her coworker left. I insist, he said. You see, sir, she was Chuck's good friend. She feels that you were unfair when you fired him. She said she was standing in solidarity with him. She set her gaze on the floor. And you, Rhonda, how do you feel about the issue? He asked. I don't care either way, sir. I'm only here to work, she answered and managed a small glance at him. I'm happy to hear that. Don't worry, I will make sure you'll have someone to work with tomorrow, he replied, his mind racing. Where was he going to find someone on such short notice? All right, sir, Rhonda replied, a slight smile on her lips. Arthur could see that she was relieved by his assurance. Arthur held his head in his hands after Rhonda left the office. It seemed like everything was going wrong since Chuck left, and he couldn't help but feel that his former protege was somehow inciting his workers. He had to think of a solution and fast. Rhonda had been with him for a long time, and she was reliable and loved her job. He couldn't risk losing her if she began to feel overworked. His mind was foggy from all the stress, and he decided to pass by the salon before he went home. This is what I was telling you about. You'd function much better if you had someone by your side helping you, Chad said. Arthur had found him at the salon, and Chad could immediately see that his friend looked worried as soon as he walked in. Don't you have any other solution for me other than to order a wife from the East? Arthur asked, and Chad wasn't lost to the hint of sarcasm. Well, do you have a better solution? Chad asked, and Arthur sighed. He was defeated, and he knew it. I guess not, he answered. I thought so, my friend, Chad replied. I'll think long and hard about it, I promise. In the meantime, I wonder where I can get a cleaning lady. Rhonda is the only one left, Arthur said. How soon do you need her? Chad asked, and Arthur's face brightened. Why, do you have someone in mind? Prosody, he asked, and his friend nodded in the affirmative. Yes, I do. I will send her over to you tomorrow, Chad replied. Thank you, Chad. I was really worried, Arthur exclaimed. He felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off of his shoulders, and he could now enjoy his ale in peace. You're welcome, Art, but I might not always have a solution for you, he teased, and Arthur laughed. Well, tell me more about the mail-order brides, Arthur said, and it seemed like this was the cue Chad had been waiting for as he began chatting away excitedly. In his bed that night, Arthur thought about everything that Chad had told him. It didn't sound so bad after all, and it brought him some level of comfort that there were other gentlemen around Lincoln who'd also married brides from the East through the mail-order bride service. He could never have guessed it in a million years. It was time for him to stop worrying that his marriage would end up just like his father's had. He now thought about his mother and how she'd walked out of her family and never looked back. Did her marriage to the other gentleman fare better than that with his father? Did he have brothers and sisters out there that he knew nothing about? His mother had never come back to check on him since she'd left, and he had no idea whether she was still alive or had died. There still existed a dull ache in his heart whenever he thought about her, but what good did it do him? She's the one who turned her back on both him and his father. He swore never to think about her ever again. It was about time. Chapter 5. Elizabeth was shocked when she arrived at Mrs. Jones's house. She had thought that Mrs. Blake's house was the largest she'd ever seen, but Mrs. Jones's was huge. They hadn't exchanged many words during the short ride to the house, and she couldn't help but feel like this wasn't the same lady she'd spoken with earlier. She now seemed cold and distant. Maybe June was right after all. A cold chill went through her body as they pulled into the well-kept driveway, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I will show you to your room, Elizabeth, Mrs. Jones said, as soon as they got off the cart. Yes, ma'am, Elizabeth said, as she followed the older lady down a long hallway. They went down a small flight of stairs, turned left, and then stopped in front of a closed door. This will be your room, Mrs. Jones said. She paused for just a second, and then turned and walked back up the stairs, leaving Elizabeth standing outside the door, unsure of what to do. This wasn't what she had expected when she'd left her job at the boarding house. She had thought she would finally feel at home working in a house, but she was now feeling more lost than she'd felt in years. She turned the lock, and the door swung open. She was immediately hit by a strong, moldy odor, and she could tell that the room had been unoccupied for a long period of time. It was sparsely furnished with a small bed with only a mattress on top, a writing desk, and a medium-sized wardrobe. She walked over to the window and swung it open, hoping to get rid of the irritating odor. She then went over to the wardrobe and opened it. There were some dated bed linens, and she removed them and went to spread the bed. Afterward, she removed her clothes from the suitcase and arranged them as neatly as she could in the wardrobe. There was a small wash basin at the corner, and Elizabeth walked over and freshened up as best as she could. Feeling worn out, she then lay down on top of the bed and closed her eyes. The loud knock on the door jolted Elizabeth from her nap, and it took her a minute to get her bearings correct. She arranged the skirts of her dress about her and then rushed to open the door. Mrs. Jones was standing there looking irate, holding some clothes in her hands. "I have been waiting upstairs for you for ages, Elizabeth. Were you really sleeping on your first day at work?" she asked as her eyes swept around the room. "I'm sorry, but I thought tomorrow would be my first day of work," she said, her bottom lip beginning to quiver. "Stop that, here," Mrs. Jones said as she handed the small pile of clothes to a shaken Elizabeth. "This is your uniform. You'll be wearing this while you work here." "Yes, ma'am," Elizabeth answered, her voice trembling. She shouldn't have left her job at the boarding house, she now regretted. "Now hurry up and change into that. I'm waiting for you upstairs," Mrs. Jones said. She then turned in a huff and walked back up the stairs. Elizabeth wiped away tears as she hurriedly changed into the uniform. Everything about Mrs. Jones's behavior reminded her of her aunt, and she couldn't believe she'd brought herself back into the same situation. She wondered whether she should go back to her old job, but she would die out of shame. She had told everyone that she had got herself the chance of a lifetime. The situation became worse for Elizabeth as the days went by. Nothing she did ever pleased Mrs. Mal Jones, and she spent most of her nights crying her eyes out in her room downstairs. The house was huge, and she couldn't manage all the chores that Mrs. Jones assigned to her. One afternoon, Mrs. Jones called her to the drawing room, and she felt that she was going to get fired that day. "Elizabeth, I'm expecting a visitor any moment now. Her name is Daisy Cobb." "Prosody rec. Show her to the drawing room as soon as she arrives," Mrs. Jones directed. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, and then turned and left the room. She couldn't wait to see who her employer was expecting. Did Mrs. Jones really have friends? She wondered. An hour later, there was a knock at the front door, and a young lady almost her age stood there looking hesitant. "Come in, Miss Cobb. Mrs. Jones is waiting for you in the drawing room." Elizabeth welcomed her inside. She looked too young to be Mrs. Jones' friend, she thought as she led her to where the madam sat waiting. She was asked to join them, and that's when Elizabeth realized that Mrs. Jones wanted to hire Daisy as a servant in the house. She was overjoyed. She would no longer face Mrs. Jones's wrath by herself. "Please come back, Daisy," Elizabeth feverishly begged when it looked like the other lady was about to turn down Mrs. Jones's offer. She learned that Daisy had previously worked for Mrs. Jones, but had left on compassionate leave when her father died. She hadn't come back, prompting Mrs. Jones to send for her. Elizabeth noticed that Daisy looked Mrs. Jones straight in the eyes, something that Elizabeth wouldn't dare to. She realized that Daisy was the kind of person she needed around with her, and she crossed her fingers. "Okay, Mrs. Jones, I will have my job back," Daisy answered, and Elizabeth could have hugged her. "I knew you would come around." Mrs. Jones gushed as well, and Elizabeth could see that she was ecstatic that Daisy had agreed to come back to work for her. Elizabeth couldn't explain why, but she felt like her life was about to take a turn for the best, and she couldn't wait. Chapter 6. Arthur managed to hire enough cleaning ladies at the boarding house as time went by, but each day he would be faced with a pile of new problems, and he felt like he was slowly losing his mind. He had tried looking for someone around town who could take Chuck's place, but none came close to what he was looking for. Sometimes in his desperation, he wished to go out and look for Chuck and beg him to come back, but he would quickly fight against that urge. He was reaching the end of his tether, and he knew it. He had to make a decision sooner than later. "Good morning, Mr. Rogers. What can I get for you this morning?" the young boy working at Mr. Logan's mercantile exclaimed when he saw Arthur. "Good morning, John," "May I have a copy of the Matrimonial Times?" He answered, and the young man gave him a strange look. "But, sir, are you sure that's the one you want?" he asked, and Arthur knew why John looked shocked. It wasn't his usual newspaper, and it seemed John knew exactly what the Matrimonial Times was all about. "Yes, John, that's the one I want. Is there a problem?" he asked, and John shook his head no. "Here you are, sir. I just thought you'd made a mistake, sir," John said as he passed Arthur the newspaper. "Thank you, John," he said after he'd paid for the publication. As he walked away, he could feel John's eyes staring at his retreating back. He smiled and continued walking towards his boarding house. Arthur walked straight to his office and locked the door behind him. He didn't need any of his employees barging in and catching him with the newspaper. He still felt uncomfortable with the idea, and he would rather people found out about his plans when he was already married. He drew in a sharp breath and then opened the paper. It was more than he could have imagined. Inside, hundreds of ads lined the pages, and he knew there wasn't a way he could go over all of them. He didn't need to, as he only wanted to see if the service was as popular as Chad had led him to believe. Now, as he flicked through the pages, there wasn't any doubt left in his mind, and he knew exactly what he needed to do. The rest of the day passed by uneventfully, and all Arthur could think about was what lay ahead for him. As much as the service was popular, it still was an unconventional way for one to find a wife, and there were many risks involved as well. What if the woman he liked wasn't who or what she said she was? What if she was a criminal disguised just as Chuck had been? What would he do then? So many ifs went through his mind that he felt like he was going crazy, and he had to stop himself. He had already decided to take his chances, and he wasn't going to develop cold feet at the last minute. That evening, he left the boarding house earlier than usual and decided that he wouldn't pass by the salon. He needed a clear head when he sat down to write down his advert. As he rode home, he felt a bit of guilt for not letting Chad know that he'd finally made up his mind. It had been Chad's idea, but Arthur felt like he needed to take the next steps without Chad holding his hand. He was the one looking for a wife after all, and not his friend. Feeling like he'd eased up on his guilt trip, Arthur rode on thinking of the words he would put down in his advert. For the first time in a long time, he wished that his father had been there to guide him, as he'd always done when he was younger. Later that night, while seated at his writing desk, Arthur blew off dust from his stationery as he marveled at how long it had been since he'd used them. He was even more shocked that they were still safely stored away after all those years. When he was younger, he'd sat at the same desk pretending to write letters to his mother, begging her to come back. His father would then take each one of them and promise that he would mail them to her later in the day. Of course, his father couldn't mail them as they had no idea where his mother was, but a young Arthur couldn't comprehend that. He would cry alone in his bed at night, wondering why his mother never wrote back. It was a bittersweet memory. He mulled over the white sheet of paper for a while before dipping the quill pen in the ink and began to jot down. A 40-year-old businessman from Lincoln, Nebraska, seeks a young, intelligent lady for marriage. She should be easy on the eye, though one of a worthy and noble character would be most appreciated. He read it out loud to himself, and though it seemed short, he felt that it would suffice. It didn't give out too much about himself, but it still was precise enough to whoever would read it. The next step would be to have it placed in the newspaper, and the rest would follow. He folded it neatly and placed it inside the pocket of the jacket he would be wearing the following day. That night, sleep eluded Arthur for hours. He tossed and turned in his bed as he thought about how his life was about to change. He had grown accustomed to living alone, and he wondered how it would feel like living with another person. It both scared and excited him. His biggest worry, though, was of being betrayed. So far, 2 very important persons in his life had left him heartbroken, and he hoped to never go through that kind of pain again. Chapter 7. Life didn't get easier at Mrs. Jones's house like Elizabeth had hoped it would with the arrival of Daisy. They'd fast become friends, and Elizabeth looked up to Daisy, who appeared to be very streetwise, and she admired that. Daisy would occasionally stand up to Mrs. Jones's cruelty, but the older lady never seemed to relent. This only infuriated her further, and she would bore down on the girls mercilessly. It became worse when Daisy left for her house each evening, leaving poor Elizabeth to face Mrs. Jones's wrath for the rest of the night. Elizabeth had hoped that Daisy would be staying at the house as well, but she'd been disappointed when Daisy had insisted on staying at the same house she'd lived in with her father. One evening after Daisy had left, Mrs. Jones called her into her bedroom. When Elizabeth entered the room, she found the older lady sitting at a desk in one corner with what looked like a book lying open on the top of the desk. "Elizabeth, I need your help here," Mrs. Jones said as she pointed at the book. "Go to page 6 of that book. I want to write down that poem for my husband. You'll read every word out loud, and I will write it down. Okay?" Elizabeth immediately started shaking, and had it been during the day, she would have run out of the house. As she stood rooted to the ground, Mrs. Jones was ready with her quill pen and ink as she eagerly waited for Elizabeth to begin reading. "Elizabeth, what are you waiting for?" Mrs. Jones asked as she turned and looked at the young girl. "Ma'am, I can't," she began as tears began to pool in her eyes. "You can't what? I'm ordering you to read, so you read," Mrs. Jones retorted. She couldn't understand why Elizabeth was finding it hard to obey such a simple order. "I can't read, ma'am," the young girl finally said with tears now streaming down her cheeks. "You can't read? I knew there was something wrong with you. You can hardly do anything right, can you? I should have never hired you," she yelled, and Elizabeth ran out of the room in tears. She burst into her room, banged the door shut behind her, and threw herself on the bed, weeping bitterly. If only Mrs. Jones knew that it wasn't her fault that she didn't know how to read or write. Her aunt had cheated her out of all of her parents' money and never bothered to take her to school. Mrs. Blake's kind face flashed through her eyes, and the ache in her heart grew stronger. If only she had stayed at the kind lady's house, her life would have turned out very differently. The following morning, when Daisy came to work, she found Elizabeth's eyes red and swollen from all the crying. And after a lot of prompting, Elizabeth only told her that Mrs. Jones had been unbearable the previous night. "I wish I can leave this place, but I have nowhere else to go," she sobbed. Daisy came closer and placed her arm on her shoulder in a comforting manner. "I know, Elizabeth. I also don't plan on staying here for much longer. Once I've saved enough money, I will go someplace far from here," Daisy said. "Where would you go?" Elizabeth asked. "I don't know, but I'll think of a place," Daisy answered. "I'll come with you when you leave." Elizabeth said, her eyes pleading, and Daisy nodded her agreement. The girls went about their chores for the rest of the day in silence. Elizabeth dreaded when Daisy would leave for home, leaving her at the mercy of Mrs. Jones. Eventually, dusk fell and Daisy went home. Luckily for Elizabeth, Mrs. Jones steered clear of what had happened the night before, and Elizabeth was grateful. She would sleep in peace that night, she thought. "I have something to show you, but not now. Later," Daisy gushed as soon as she came in for work. "Tell me, what is it?" Elizabeth asked, unable to contain her excitement. Plus 7%. "A little patience, Elizabeth. You'll know soon enough," Daisy said to a visibly disappointed Elizabeth. Later on that afternoon during their lunch break, the girls saw Mrs. Jones leave the house with the coach driver. Daisy excitedly pulled Elizabeth into the kitchen and removed some papers from her dress pocket. She carefully placed them on the kitchen table and turned to her friend, her eyes shining. "What's that?" Elizabeth asked. She could see it was a piece of a paper with some writing on it, but she couldn't read what was written. The other night's episode was repeating itself. "It's a page from a newspaper," Daisy replied, and Elizabeth saw the look of amusement on her face. Daisy must have thought that she was pretending not to know what it was. "What's it about?" she asked again, and Daisy gave her the same look. "Why don't you read it and find it?" she said, pushing the paper across the table towards her, and Elizabeth felt trapped. She had no choice now but to divulge her secret. "I can't read," she managed to say. Daisy stared at her for a moment, trying to mask her shock, but it was as clear as day for Elizabeth to see. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. I didn't realize. Don't worry about it. I will tell you what it says, Daisy said, her eyes now full of compassion for her friend. Daisy went on to explain carefully what the ads entailed, and Elizabeth hung on to each word, her eyes wide with amazement. She'd never heard of the service that Daisy was so passionately talking about, but the more her friend spoke, the more the idea began to grow on her. Hien. Chapter 8. I'm going to write to one of the gentlemen, Daisy announced, and Elizabeth thought that her friend was out of her mind. What will you say to him? She asked, looking astonished. I'll introduce myself and hopefully he will send me a reply. Hey, you should write to one of them as well, Daisy excitedly said, and Elizabeth's face instantly fell. What is it now? Don't you want to leave this place? It's not that. How will I do that? And yet I can't read or write, she explained, and Daisy could have kicked herself. She had forgotten what Elizabeth had confessed to her earlier. Oh, don't worry about that. I will help you, Daisy said, and her friend's eyes lit up. You'd do that for me, Daisy? She asked. Of course, Daisy replied. Now, let's find ourselves husbands before Mrs. Jones comes back. The girls spent the next few hours before Mrs. Jones's arrival going over the ads, and most of them were so ridiculous that they found themselves rolling with laughter. Would you like a farmer, Elizabeth? Daisy asked, pointing at one of the ads. What would I do on a farm, Daisy? Would you? Elizabeth threw the question back at her friend. Not in this lifetime. I don't want to be a farmer's wife. Can you imagine seeing animal droppings all over the place and their smell? Daisy posed as she pinched her nose as if she could smell the cow dung already. At the sight of her friend's ridiculousness, Elizabeth burst out into laughter. Finally, Daisy settled on a bakery owner from Brownsville, Nebraska, while Elizabeth settled on a boarding house owner from Lincoln, Nebraska. They were both excited that both gentlemen were from Nebraska, and should they eventually get married to them, they would only be living towns apart from each other. I'm sure the Wicked Witch is on her way back. Quick, let's be done with our remaining chores, Daisy said. She'd barely finished talking when the older lady strode into the kitchen, a fierce look in her eyes. They'd been so engrossed in the ads that they'd failed to notice as she rode into the driveway. What are you two whispering about in the kitchen? Daisy, what's that? She asked, as Daisy managed in time to shove the newspaper page down her bosoms. It's nothing, Mrs. Jones, she answered with a straight face. The older lady's lower lip trembled with fury, but Daisy stood her ground. Elizabeth, what's going on here? She asked. If she was going to find out the truth, the timid girl would surely spill the beans, she mused. It's nothing, Mrs. Jones, Elizabeth calmly answered, and her employer was taken aback. She was finally coming out of her shell, Mrs. Jones observed before turning around and walking out of the room in a huff. Both girls broke into pearls of laughter as the skirts of her dress flew wildly behind her as she angrily walked away. One of these fine days, she won't have anyone left working for her, Daisy said, amused. I don't know, Daisy. Isn't that a bit too harsh? Elizabeth quipped, and Daisy just stared at her in disbelief. Even after all that Mrs. Jones had done to them, Elizabeth still felt sorry for her. Do you still wish to go ahead with this, or you'd rather remain here? I'll be writing to my gentleman tonight. If you want, I can write yours too, and I can read it to you tomorrow, Daisy said. Oh no, nothing has changed, Daisy. You go ahead and write my letter too. It's just that I can't help but feel a little sad for Mrs. Jones. She will be all alone as Mr. Jones is always traveling, she said, trying to explain her compassionate nature, but Daisy would hear none of it. Maybe she deserves to be alone, she said, and Elizabeth could only stare at her in disbelief. The following morning, Elizabeth couldn't wait for her friend to arrive so she could read the letter to her. She'd trusted Daisy would do a good job, but she needed to hear what had been written. Shortly after, Daisy walked in and they went behind the house before Mrs. Jones woke up. She removed Elizabeth's letter from her pocket and began to read. Dear Sir, my name is Elizabeth Long. I'm originally from Independence, Missouri, but I now live in Kansas City, Missouri. Have you ever been to Missouri? I'm 20 years old and I work as a house servant. Your ad caught my eye, and I feel we share the same dreams about the future. I wish to make your acquaintance, should you share the same sentiments. I eagerly await your reply. Yours sincerely, Elizabeth Long. What do you think? Daisy asked as soon as she finished reading. I like it very much. Thank you, Daisy, Elizabeth said as she stared dreamingly at the white sheet of paper. I will mail them at the postal exchange this evening on my way home, Daisy said. Do you think they will write us back? Elizabeth asked, her voice filled with doubt. Of course they will. If they don't, we will write to a few others. Did you see how many there are? She asked, and her friend immediately relaxed. I guess you're right, Elizabeth answered. As Elizabeth lay in bed that night, all she could think about was the letter she was sure her friend had mailed by then. The said gentleman owned a boarding house, and at 40 years of age, she was sure that he was well established in life. What if he thought she was too young at 20 years old? She was scared that should Daisy leave Missouri first, then that would be the end of her dreams. She would probably find no other person willing to help her out as Daisy had done. She would never be able to write to any other gentleman after that. She crossed her fingers and prayed that it wouldn't come to that. Chapter 9. Chapter 9. Arthur picked up the huge stack of letters from the postal exchange and hurriedly stuffed them in his pockets. He still felt a bit strange about the whole arrangement, but it was now too late to back out. His friend Chad was still in the dark, and he had recently stopped talking to Arthur about the issue, assuming that his friend was no longer keen on the subject. Arthur couldn't imagine the reaction he would have when he finally let him in on the truth. But that wouldn't be until he'd identified his bride and she was on her way to Nebraska. He walked into his office and locked the door behind him. He needed to carefully read each letter without any interruptions. Arthur's hands were clammy with sweat as he pulled out each letter, and he could feel a thin streak of sweat running down his back. He stopped what he was doing, walked over to the window, and opened it. A strong gush of wind blew into the room and into his face, and he felt a bit better. He walked back to his desk and sat down. A tiny smile formed on his lips as he realized that he was doing everything he could to delay opening the letters. Feeling silly, he finally picked up one, opened it, and the first line threw him off. He placed it on the side. He read a few more, and the rejected pile grew higher. Almost all of them were clearly only interested in the fact that he owned a boarding house. Would he ever find one that appealed to him? He wondered. He was almost giving up when one of the letters caught his attention. It was from a young lady from Kansas City, Missouri, who worked as a house servant. He read the letter once again, and he was impressed by how eloquently she had expressed herself. He had found her. He had no doubt in his mind that this was the lady he was searching for. One thing made him slightly uneasy. She was half his age, and he wasn't sure if she had clearly seen his age. He would have to ask her in his next letter so they could be on the same page. Satisfied, he picked up all the letters he'd placed aside, plus the ones he hadn't read, and returned them to his pockets. He would throw all of them into the fireplace later that evening when he went home. Arthur thought long and hard before he began writing his reply to the young girl from Missouri. Her name was Elizabeth Long. He wanted his words to be clear, precise, and to the point. That was the only way he would be sure whether she really wanted to continue with their acquaintance given the huge difference in their ages. He would pause halfway through the letter every now and then and ask himself if he would be able to place another ad should she turn out not to be the one after all. Probably not, he sighed. When he was done writing, he read and reread the letter a couple more times until he was satisfied that it was perfect. He then placed it in an envelope and sealed it. He would mail it first thing the following day. Exhausted from the day's happenings, Arthur dragged himself to bed, but sleep took longer to come than he'd imagined. He was having so many conflicting thoughts in his mind that he felt that he needed to talk to Chad about some of his fears come the following day. When sleep did come, he dreamed that he'd married Elizabeth and that she'd taken over the business and thrown him out on the streets. Arthur had startled awake in the middle of the night, his whole body drenched in sweat. Chad listened carefully as his friend spoke about his fears and worries. He couldn't understand why Arthur was giving the subject so much thought, and he was yet to warm up to the idea. He waited until Arthur was done speaking, and then it was his chance. Earlier in the day, he'd been pleasantly surprised when Arthur had sent an errand boy to his home asking that they meet later at the salon. Now, here they were, and Arthur couldn't stop talking. The subject seemed to be weighing heavily on his chest, and Chad was only too happy to listen to his grievances. If a 20-year-old showed interest in you, why would that be a bad thing? You're looking for someone to bear you an heir, and who better than a young lady? Or would you prefer an old maid? Chad posed, and he could see his friend mulling over his sentiments. I guess I didn't look at it that way, Arthur agreed. His friend was right, and maybe he shouldn't be keeping him in the dark that he'd already found a promising prospect. I don't understand why you have so many questions, and yet you're not in communication with anyone, Chad said. I only wanted to find out just in case I decide to use the mail-order bride service in future. Arthur blatantly lied to his friend, and he was ashamed of himself. So you're considering what I told you? I still think it's the best option for you. Chad stressed to his friend. I don't know, Chad, but you'll be the first person to know when I make my decision. Arthur lied again. The discussion turned to business, and it was almost dark when they parted ways, with each going to their homes. As he rode home, Arthur was once again overcome with guilt for lying to his friend who had been nothing but supportive to him. He hoped that Chad would still be as understanding when he finally told him the truth. Chapter 10. It's here, Elizabeth. It's finally here, Daisy shouted excitedly as soon as she arrived to work that morning. She was too overjoyed to care whether Mrs. Jones heard her or not. What is, Daisy? Careful, you will awaken Mrs. Jones, Elizabeth said as her friend rushed into the kitchen, waving a white envelope in the air. I don't care for Mrs. Jones. You won't either when you hear about what I've got for you, Daisy said as she handed the envelope to her friend. What's this? Elizabeth asked. She was beginning to get excited as well. There, it's yours. Open it and I will read it for you, Daisy answered as she shoved the envelope into Elizabeth's open palm. Is this what I think it is? Elizabeth asked, and her hands began to tremble. Yes, it is. Hurry up and open it, Daisy urged as Elizabeth tried to stabilize her shaking hands. I picked it up from the postal exchange on my way home yesterday. Elizabeth summoned all of her strength and ripped the envelope open. Inside was a neatly folded piece of paper, and as she unfolded it, she wished she could have been the one to read and find out what was written on it. She passed the letter over to Daisy, who made a big spectacle of the moment before she read the letter, and it brought a smile to Elizabeth's lips. Dear Elizabeth, I received your letter with a grateful heart. My name is Arthur Rogers, and I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm 40 years old, and I was wondering if you are okay with that. I might be a little bit too old for you, but you're the perfect age for me. I own and run a boarding house here in Lincoln. Yes, I'm very much interested in knowing more about you, if you still are. I eagerly await your next letter, maybe. Yours sincerely, Arthur Rogers. What did I tell you? He truly likes you. In fact, he's the one scared that you might reject him for his age, Daisy explained, but Elizabeth was in her own world. He really liked her. He did. Her heart danced. Elizabeth? Yes, Daisy, I heard you. I have no problem with his age, she said, still not believing that this was happening. Then we should write to him and let him know that you're fine with his age, Daisy said. Yes, I agree, Elizabeth said. All right, I will write to him when I get home, Daisy promised. The rest of the day flew by, and Elizabeth felt as if nothing could touch her. A man was genuinely interested in her. She felt as if not even Miss Jones's cruelty could dampen her spirits. Daisy wrote Elizabeth's letter as promised, and when she read it out loud to her, Elizabeth couldn't be more delighted. She asked Daisy to mail it that same evening, feeling that the sooner the letter got to Arthur, the sooner he would write back. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth received his reply, and a correspondence was established. Daisy would write for her as well as read her replies. Soon, Arthur proposed marriage, and Elizabeth happily accepted. It helped that Daisy had also been proposed to, and she'd accepted as well. There was no turning back now. They would both soon be leaving for Nebraska. "Do you think we should tell Mrs. Jones before we leave?" Elizabeth had asked Daisy, even though she already knew the answer. "Of course not. Why should we? The woman has been nothing but mean to us," Daisy had replied. Elizabeth decided to push some more. "I think we should. She was gracious enough to offer us jobs," she said, and Daisy glared at her. "Gracious my foot. She has done nothing since she offered us the so-called jobs." Daisy spat out the word, and Elizabeth gave up. Arthur asked Elizabeth to travel on the wagon train, and since she had no idea what that was, she'd leaned on Daisy, who would also be traveling by the same means to guide her. They'd plan everything when Mrs. Jones was asleep or had gone out, but they'd almost been caught a couple of times. "You will sneak out in the evening and come to my house without saying a word to anyone," Daisy told Elizabeth. "Maybe we should tell her she'll be on her own since Mr. Jones is away on business," Elizabeth said. "If you tell her, you won't leave the house. She might even hold you hostage. If that happens, I will leave without you." Daisy cautioned Elizabeth, who thought for a while and then nodded her agreement. "Okay, I will do as you ask," she said. "Good," Daisy shot back. As the day of their departure drew closer, Elizabeth began to develop cold feet. Nowhere in her letters had it been mentioned that she was illiterate. She worried that Arthur wouldn't be able to forgive her once he found out that she hadn't been completely truthful with him. She wished she had been open enough with him and let him know everything about her when he'd proposed to her. It was now too late, and she had no choice but to travel to Nebraska. The only thing that she was happy about was that he owned a boarding house, and even though she hadn't told him that she'd previously worked in one, she at least had something she could do when she went to Nebraska. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was so much she hadn't told him about herself. Mrs. Jones would catch her deep in thought, and no matter how hard she tried to demean her, Elizabeth never shed a tear, something that always took the older woman by surprise. When Elizabeth had arrived at the house, she would easily break into tears whenever Mrs. Jones threw hurtful words at her. Lately, something seemed to have changed, and Mrs. Jones could have given anything to find out what it was. Maybe it was Daisy's stubbornness rubbing off on her, she'd thought. Chapter 11. Arthur realized his mistake the moment he went back home that evening. In his excitement, he had forgotten to enclose some money in his last letter to Elizabeth for her travels. There was nothing he could do now, as she was set to leave for Nebraska in a few weeks. She'd sounded like a well-grounded lady, and he knew she would find a way to get to him. This brought him to the next issue that had been on his mind since she'd accepted his marriage proposal. He couldn't take her to his house as an unmarried man, living alone, and he didn't know whether she would be comfortable staying at the boarding house for a few days before they were married. His last conversation with Chad had been quite enlightening, even though he hadn't been forthcoming with the real reason why he was asking so many questions. Suddenly, an idea came to him. Since he had already confirmed that Elizabeth was traveling to Nebraska, then he felt like it was time he let Chad in on what was happening. He would take that opportunity to ask him whether he and his family could host Elizabeth for a couple of days till they were married. That way, Elizabeth would get to know Chad and his family well, since he was her husband-to-be's best friend. It was decided. He would speak to Chad the following day. "What are you saying to me? You've been all along communicating with this girl, and you never bothered to tell me? I thought we were better friends than that," Chad said, his voice calm, but the expression on his face said otherwise. "I didn't want to jinx it by saying something before I was sure that she was truly coming to Nebraska," Arthur said, wishing in his mind that he'd told his friend everything from the beginning. "That's the lamest excuse if I've ever heard one." Chad set his eyes boring into Arthur's. "I know it doesn't sound like it, but I thought I was doing the right thing," Arthur said, and then paused, hoping Chad would say something. He didn't. "So, will you do me the favor I'd asked of you? That's the real reason you're telling me about her, isn't it? If you didn't need my help, you wouldn't have told me about her at all. I'd have had to find out about it like everybody else. After she was already here and probably married to you by then. Chad spat, and Arthur knew that his friend was really furious. You're blowing everything out of proportion, Chad. That wasn't my intention at all, Arthur pleaded, but he could tell that Chad was very hurt. This wasn't what he'd thought would happen, and he was worried that their friendship wouldn't survive this betrayal, as Chad looked at it. Well, you keep saying that, Arthur, but I don't believe you. I'm afraid this time you're on your own, Chad as he downed that last of his ale and stood up. Good luck. Wait, Chad, don't leave like this, Arthur begged, but Chad was already out of his seat. Will you at least come to the wedding? No, Arthur, I'd rather not, Chad answered before he turned and walked towards the door. Arthur watched as his friend walked out of the door, his back rigid with anger. Chad had been too upset that he'd even referred to him by his full name, Arthur, instead of his usual playful Art. Had he just lost his longtime friend in the blink of an eye? Arthur wondered as a cold feeling settled at the pit of his stomach. As the days passed, Arthur knew that he had to make preparations for Elizabeth's arrival, and sadly without Chad's help. They hadn't seen each other since that fateful day at the salon, and the situation was weighing heavily on Arthur, as Chad was the only friend he could fully trust. He hoped that one day sooner than later Chad would find it in his heart to forgive him. Zabe lied. Being a person who hated lies and secrets himself, Arthur knew that Chad was hurt by his actions, and he was willing to give him as much time as possible for him to finally understand why Arthur had acted the way he had. He'd decided that Elizabeth would stay at the boarding house in the room that had been Chuck's. It was still in pristine condition, but it needed to be cleaned and aired out. He would then give it a coat of fresh paint, and it would look as good as new. Sir, I have finished cleaning the room, and the moldy smell is all but gone, the cleaner said when Arthur showed up at the room's doorway. Thank you, Gina. I will paint it later on to make it look more pleasant, he answered. It was slowly turning out better than he'd expected, and he was happy. He was sure Elizabeth would like it too when she arrived. Do you need help with the painting, sir? The girl asked. No, Gina. You can head on home now and I will finish up, he answered. He could have easily found someone to help him, but he felt he needed to do this himself. It was already dark when he stepped out of the boarding house. It had taken him longer to paint the room that he had envisioned, but he was happy that it had turned out better than he'd imagined. As he walked towards his cart, he saw Chad walking on the opposite side of the street as he headed towards the saloon. Their eyes met, and Chad quickly looked away before he disappeared through the saloon's open doors. As Arthur climbed onto the cart, he wondered for how long his friend was going to be this upset with him. Chad hadn't bothered to ask about Elizabeth the last time they'd met, and yet there was so much that Arthur needed to tell him about her. Arthur was sure that Chad would have approved of her. Chapter 12. Elizabeth pushed her suitcase a little further under the bed. She then walked back a few steps and checked whether it could be easily spotted by someone walking into the room. It wasn't, and she smiled. Earlier on in the day, Daisy had told her that they only had 3 days left until they traveled to Nebraska. On the third day, she would sneak out of Mrs. Jones's house at dusk and go over to Daisy's small apartment. They would then leave together on the following morning for Independence, where they were to join the wagon train. It was all looking good, but she was still bothered by an issue that kept lingering on her mind, especially after Daisy had told her about what would be needed for the long journey. Although she had some money saved, she felt that it wouldn't be enough. At this point, the future seemed bleak, and she felt like she couldn't make the journey after all. Feeling helpless, Elizabeth walked back to the bed, knelt down, and removed the suitcase from under it. It had been wishful thinking, but the odds seemed to be stacked high against her. You look sad, Elizabeth. Shouldn't you be happy? Daisy asked her friend the following morning when she reported for work. I'm afraid I won't be able to make the journey, Elizabeth replied, and her face fell. What do you mean? Why would you change your mind when we're this close? Daisy asked, puzzled. She had learned to expect anything from her friend, but this was a bit too much. "I haven't changed my mind, Daisy. I just can't," she answered, and Daisy thought she saw her friend's eyes shining with tears. "Why, Elizabeth?" Daisy asked, and Elizabeth went to say something, but then decided against it. "Please, you can tell me what your reasons are." I don't have enough money for the journey. I thought Arthur was going to send me some, but he didn't," she answered, and to her shock, Daisy burst out laughing. "Is that all? You fret too much. Don't worry. I have enough money for both of us. I will buy us a wagon and everything else we will need for the duration of the journey," Daisy answered. "Thank you, Daisy. You've done so much for me already," Elizabeth answered as relief washed over her. She would be leaving this house after all, she thought happily. Elizabeth watched helplessly as once again Mrs. Jones slowly added final touches to her knitting. She would see a section that didn't sit well with her, and she would undo it only for her to make the same mistake again. She kept sending the poor girl to and from her bedroom as she made endless requests. At this rate, she was never going to be able to sneak out. Elizabeth felt panic begin to come over her. She looked towards the windows, and she could see that it was slowly becoming dark. She was supposed to be out by dusk, but hours later, Mrs. Jones still had her firmly by her side. It was hard to understand why, on this particular evening, Mrs. Jones only wanted her to be by her side. She thought of walking to her room, picking up her suitcase, and proudly walking out of the house, but courage failed her. Half an hour long later, Mrs. Jones placed her knitting needles onto the nearest coffee table and rose from her seat. "Elizabeth, don't touch anything. I will be back shortly," she announced, and hurriedly walked out of the drawing room. Elizabeth tiptoed behind her and saw that she was going upstairs to her bedroom, probably to her private washroom. This was the chance Elizabeth had been waiting for. She dashed downstairs to her bedroom, pulled the suitcase from under her bed, and ran out of the house. It was dark outside, but she was determined to make it to Daisy's apartment. She hurriedly walked down the almost empty street while silently saying a prayer that no harm should befall her. Somber. 10 minutes later, she was standing outside of her friend's apartment, and she knocked softly. It was dark inside and no one showed up to the door for a while, but when she knocked again, a light flickered inside, and almost immediately, Daisy appeared at the door. "What took you so long? I was beginning to worry that you'd changed your mind," Daisy said as she ushered Elizabeth into the house. She rubbed her eyes as they walked in, and Elizabeth could see that Daisy had been sleeping. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Jones almost ruined our plans. She had me by her side the entire evening, and I was beginning to worry that I would be able to make it here," she explained, and Daisy nodded her understanding. "I was afraid something like that could happen. Mrs. Jones would do anything to ruin our plans should she know about them. I was afraid that I would have had to leave without you tomorrow," Daisy said as she sighed with relief. "I was beginning to worry too," Elizabeth answered as Daisy led her to a couch in the tiny living room. After a simple dinner that evening, the girls discussed their plans for the following day. Later on, they talked about their early lives, and Elizabeth could now understand why Daisy was always distrustful of those possessed of means. When they went to bed, Elizabeth tossed and turned as she pondered over what awaited her in Nebraska. How would Arthur react when he realized she could neither read nor write? She would be horrified if he were to send her back. Chapter 13. Elizabeth startled awake to Daisy staring down at her as she shook her vigorously on one shoulder while calling out her name. She rubbed her bleary eyes trying to figure out where she was. It took her only a minute to realize where she was. "I didn't oversleep, did I?" she inquired in a panic as she jumped out of bed. "No, you haven't, but we should be up early so we can begin to prepare ourselves for the long trip ahead," Daisy replied. "It's still dark outside. What time is it?" Elizabeth asked, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. She had stayed up longer last night than she would have wanted, lost in her thoughts. Now, she wished she could sleep for just a little bit longer. "It's time to leave Missouri. Hurry, get up and go and take a bath. I will cook some breakfast for us," Daisy answered, and Elizabeth had no choice but to drag herself into the washroom. After breakfast, the girls checked on their luggage as they waited for the buggy that Daisy had hired to take them to Independence. Elizabeth noticed Daisy lingering around the rooms longer than usual, and she knew that her friend was feeling nostalgic about moving out of the only place she'd called home for years. "You'll make new memories where you're going, Daisy," she said, and when her friend turned to look at her, she saw tears shining in her eyes. Elizabeth walked over to Daisy, and she placed a comforting hand on her friend's shoulder. "I know, Elizabeth, but I feel like I'm leaving my father behind," Daisy answered as she now sobbed freely. Elizabeth was taken aback. She had never seen her friend being so vulnerable. "I know this is what he'd have wanted for you," she said, trying to console Daisy. "I know, and I'm sorry to have broken down like this," Daisy said as she sniffed and blew her nose. "It's okay. That at least I got to see you weak for a change." Elizabeth teased her, and they both laughed, the unpleasant moment instantly behind them. As they sat on the couch, talking about how happy they both were to leave Missouri, there was a gentle knock at the door. Daisy quickly rushed to see who it was. Elizabeth heard a male voice say something, and Daisy came back looking excited. "The taxi buggy driver is here," she exclaimed, with the driver following closely behind her. She pointed to where the suitcases were. "Could you please take those to the buggy?" "Yes, miss, with pleasure," he replied as he easily picked up the luggage and walked back out. "Let's go, Elizabeth," Daisy said. She then gave the place she'd called home one last glance, and both girls walked out. The gentleman helped them both onto the buggy, and before long they were riding down the street toward Independence. They rode on in silence, each engrossed in their own thoughts. Daisy would every now and then point out to Elizabeth places where she'd been as a child and the wonderful memories they held for her. She would tear up a couple of times, and Elizabeth could see how hard it was for her to leave Kansas City behind. As they neared Independence, Elizabeth's early childhood memories came flooding back, and she was the one now feeling nostalgic. Although many years had passed, she could vividly remember the day she'd left her house with Mrs. Firth, not realizing that her life would never be the same again. She closed her eyes, and the next memory she had was of her Aunt Norma uprooting her from Mrs. Blake's home to a life that was full of misery. "Are you okay?" Daisy asked, and it was only then did Elizabeth realize that she had tears rolling freely down her cheeks. "Being back here reminds me of my earlier life with my mother before she died," she answered, as she pointed towards the sprawling land yonder. "I can only imagine how painful that must be for you. Can you by any chance remember where your house was located?" Daisy asked. She felt that maybe they could go over there before their trip began, for Elizabeth to say her last goodbyes. "I don't think so. I was 5 years old when I moved in with the Blakes, and 7 years old when my Aunt Norma sold the house," she replied, the events of those past years still fresh in her mind. "And your Aunt Norma, do you know where she is now?" Daisy asked. "No, I don't, and I'm glad. I never want to see her again," she said as she wiped her tears. "It's okay. We're leaving Missouri and all the bad memories behind," Daisy said, and Elizabeth nodded her agreement. It was time to move on, she thought to herself. Half an hour later, the driver dropped them off in an open field where a large number of wagons were parked. He helped them down with a smile and unloaded their luggage. "Here we are, ladies. Thank you very much," Daisy told him as she reached into her reticule and removed some money. She handed him his wages, and he rode off. Elizabeth stood rooted to the ground as she stared at the sea of people milling around the wagons. There were women, men, as well as children, and it seemed as though some of them were complete families. "I didn't realize there would be this many people," she said, and her friends smiled at her apparent ignorance. "All of them are travelers on the wagon train just like us," Daisy answered. "I wouldn't have known where to start hadn't it been for you," Elizabeth said as tears began to pool in her eyes once more. "Come on now, don't cry. I'm delighted to have you as my traveling companion," Daisy reassured her friend. They then both fell silent as they looked around them thoughtfully. Daisy's mind was spinning as she wondered about where she could buy a wagon. "We now need to buy ourselves a wagon." Do you know where they're bought? Elizabeth asked innocently. No, but I'm about to find out, Daisy answered as she waved over a young man who was walking by. He hesitated and unfazed. Daisy walked the short distance to where he stood. Chapter 14. Elizabeth quietly watched as Daisy exchanged a few words with the young man, and after a short while, he walked away. Daisy came back to where Elizabeth stood waiting for her. Do you see that older man over there? I'm going to talk to him. Keep an eye on our luggage until I come back, Daisy instructed as she pointed to an older man standing by the wagons. Okay, Elizabeth answered, and Daisy rushed off. She watched as Daisy had a short conversation with the man, and soon they were smiling at each other like old friends. It never ceased to amaze Elizabeth how Daisy could make friends with almost anyone when she needed help. After a few more minutes, Daisy reached into her reticule and handed something over to the man. Daisy then ran back to her. Her face flashed with excitement. Guess what? She gushed, and Elizabeth only stared at her, anxiously waiting to hear the good news. What? She asked when Daisy took too long to answer her. We now have ourselves a wagon. We only need to load it up with enough provisions for the trip and we're good to go, Daisy announced. Do you want to see it? Yes, of course, Elizabeth answered as excitement began to build up in her. Okay, let's go, Daisy answered. They began pulling their heavy suitcases down the hill towards the wagon as they chatted excitedly. As Elizabeth turned to say something to Daisy, she suddenly bumped hard into someone and almost sent both of them sprawling to the ground. Pardon me, miss, but you're standing in the way, Elizabeth said as she turned to look at the lady who'd caused the mishap. She was trying hard to steady herself with a look of sheer panic on her face. Elizabeth's heart went out to her. She looked lost and scared, and something about her reminded Elizabeth of herself. She mumbled something, but Elizabeth didn't quite catch it, as Daisy was already impatiently pulling her down towards the wagon. She doesn't look poor like the rest of us. I wonder what she's doing here, Daisy sneered as they neared their wagon. She looks lost and scared to me, Elizabeth said. She then turned towards where they'd left the young lady. She was still standing in the same spot, looking confused and out of place. Something isn't right with her. She isn't the only one, Daisy spat as she turned and gave the young lady a dirty look. Elizabeth sighed in resignation. They tried to load the suitcases onto the wagon to no avail. Daisy looked angry, and Elizabeth wondered what was irking her this time, but she wasn't about to ask. She knew when to leave well alone. Daisy tried in vain to load her suitcase onto the wagon, and when that failed, for a third time, she kicked the luggage in fury. Do you ladies need help? A voice asked, and when Elizabeth turned around to look, she saw that it was the older man who'd been speaking to Daisy earlier. Yes, McGuire, would you help us load our luggage on the wagon? Daisy asked, and McGuire smiled and moved closer. Of course I can. Step back, he instructed as he picked up each suitcase and loaded it onto the wagon. If that's all, ladies, then I will be on my way. McGuire, this is my friend Elizabeth. She's traveling with me, Daisy said, and then turned to her friend. Elizabeth, this is McGuire. He's the wagon master. What's a wagon master? Elizabeth whispered into Daisy's ear. He's the person in charge of the wagon train. Daisy answered, doing her best to whisper back, but it seemed as if McGuire had heard the entire conversation from the amused look on his face. Ladies, McGuire said, as he tipped the brim of his hat to the ladies, and then he walked away. As soon as McGuire left, Daisy said something, but Elizabeth wasn't paying attention. Prosody rate %. Her mind was still on the young lady that she'd bumped into earlier. The look of panic in her eyes reminded Elizabeth of how she had felt when she was riding out of Mrs. Blake's house with Aunt Norma. She'd had no idea where her aunt was taking her, and she'd been feeling lost and confused, just like the poor young lady. She might have been dressed in an elegant dress, but Elizabeth could tell that she needed help. Elizabeth? Daisy said, startling Elizabeth from her trail of thoughts. What did you say? She asked, looking like she'd just awoken from a dream. Daisy shook her head in dismay. Why do you look so preoccupied? She asked. I was thinking about her, she answered as she pointed towards the young lady. I see, but I still insist there's nothing wrong with her. She could be waiting for someone. Could be her husband, perhaps, Daisy answered. She was becoming tired of talking about a total stranger, and she wished Elizabeth would just let it go. I don't think so, Elizabeth began, but Daisy threw up her hands in exasperation. It's nearing our departure time, and we still haven't bought our provisions for the journey, Daisy said, trying to keep her voice calm. Had she needed help, she would have said something by now. Okay, let's go, Elizabeth said, and they began walking towards the stores lined up across the street. As they passed by the young lady again, Elizabeth wished she could stop and talk to her for a while, but Daisy would never allow it. Still, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that Lady needed some help. Could she be running from a dangerous situation? She wondered. Chapter 15. The girls went from one store to the other as they bought everything they needed to sustain them on the long journey. Elizabeth wanted to pay for some of the items, but Daisy would hear none of it. Keep your money safely, Elizabeth. You might need it later. I already told you I have more than enough, Daisy insisted, and Elizabeth stopped offering. 4 months is a long time being on the trail, Elizabeth sighed. I agree. It's quite a long time. Do you think we have everything we need? Daisy asked. Yes, I do. It might even be more than enough, Elizabeth answered. Okay, let's return to the wagon. We still have to load all of this, Daisy said as she picked up 2 of the 4 small sacks and Elizabeth carried the rest. They loaded the small sacks all by themselves onto the wagon this time, and when they were done, they breathed a huge sigh of relief as they sat back and admired their work. We should be leaving any minute now, Daisy said. How do you know everything about the wagon train, and yet this is your first time traveling? Elizabeth asked. I told you I was going to look for information, and that's exactly what I did, Daisy answered, as she leaned back on the inside of the wagon. Just then, someone knocked on the side of the wagon, catching the girls by surprise. Daisy motioned for Elizabeth to find out who it was. It was McGuire, and standing timidly next to him was the young lady Elizabeth had been worrying about all afternoon. Elizabeth, I was wondering whether you and Daisy would mind riding with this nice lady to Nebraska. There's been a problem with her wagon, he asked. Of course, McGuire, we would be happy to. Isn't it, Daisy? She asked as she stuck her head back in to be met with Daisy's sour face. It's no problem, Daisy answered through gritted teeth. Their journey commenced shortly after, and the girls learned that their new travel companion, whose name was Cindy, was nothing like Daisy had assumed. You're going to Nebraska as a mail-order bride too? Daisy had asked in astonishment. Yes, my fiancé is waiting for me in Lincoln, she answered. Well, what do you know? Elizabeth here is also going to Lincoln, Daisy said. Where are you going? Cindy asked her. I'm going to Brownsville, she answered. Their first night on the trail was uneventful, and as the days went by, they all realized that even though they'd all come from very different backgrounds, their end goal was the same, to make a better life for themselves out west. 4 months passed, and all the travelers on the wagon train were excited that they'd made it through the treacherous terrain safely, after braving extremely hot afternoons and icy cold nights. As the girls lay down to sleep on the last night of the trip, sadness overcame them as they would be bidding each other farewell the following morning. They'd learned a lot about one another during the journey and had become close friends. Cindy and I will be jumping off tomorrow, Daisy, Elizabeth said sadly. I'm going to miss you both very much, she answered. You two were the best travel companions I could have asked for, Cindy said. You're welcome, rich girl. Daisy teased, and they all laughed. The following day, Elizabeth and Cindy jumped off in Lincoln, leaving Daisy to proceed to Brownsville. This is where we part ways, dear Cindy, Elizabeth said as she placed her suitcase down next to her feet. Yes, sadly, we now must say goodbye. Hopefully we shall meet sometime, Cindy answered, her voice choking with tears. That would be wonderful, Elizabeth answered. They hugged each other tightly before Cindy turned and walked away, fighting back tears. Elizabeth studied her surroundings as she wondered where to go next. 7%. The stores lining up the streets had words written on them, but she didn't know what was written on them. How was she going to find the postal exchange where Arthur had instructed that she wait for him? She thought of asking for help, but every time a person walked by, she would become tongue-tied. Why hadn't she asked Cindy for help before she left? A lone tear of frustration ran down her cheek, and she quickly brushed it away with her gloved finger before someone saw her. Throwing caution to the wind, she tried lifting up her suitcase, but it was too heavy. She could hardly get it off the ground. She decided to drag it along the dusty path and began walking towards an old-looking building a few yards ahead. Could it be the one? She wondered. Perhaps, when she got close to the postal exchange, she would see people walking out with letters in their hands, like she'd seen so many times in Missouri. Arthur had told her that it was the only postal exchange in Lincoln, and it shouldn't be hard to find. If only she knew how to read, she thought as she looked around helplessly. "Miss, do you need help with your suitcase?" a voice asked from behind her, and she quickly turned to see who it was. A tall gentleman was staring down at her, with a kind look in his eyes, and she felt that she could trust him. "Yes, sir, I would appreciate that," she answered. The gentleman smiled warmly at her and tipped his hat to her. "I'm glad to help, miss. Where are you headed?" he asked. "To the postal exchange, sir," she answered. He nodded his head in acknowledgement as he effortlessly picked up her suitcase from the ground. "It's this way, miss, if you will follow me," he said. They walked for a few minutes down the street before he finally stopped in front of a medium-sized building and pointed at a huge wooden sign hanging from the roof. "Here it is," he said, thinking that she could read the writings herself. She pretended that she was reading the words and then smiled. "Yes, I see that. Thank you very much," she said. "You're welcome, miss. Lincoln is a great town. I hope you'll enjoy your stay here," he said as he placed the suitcase on the ground and walked away. It was only then did Elizabeth realize that he hadn't introduced himself, and neither had she asked for his name. If all men were like him here, then she was off to a great start, she mused. Chapter 16. Arthur recognized her the moment he came round the corner, leading to the front door of the postal exchange. She was facing the other side, and she didn't see or hear him approach. She was dressed in a beige dress with wide, long skirts that swayed gently in the wind, and her arms were covered in white silk gloves up to the elbows, just like she had told him. He clutched the single red rose in his hand tightly as he slowly walked towards her. "Miss Long?" he said when he was within a few inches from her. She quickly turned around, startled. "Yes?" she said. The gentleman standing behind her was dressed in a pair of jeans, a red checked shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that covered most of his thick dark hair. He definitely wasn't the same man who'd helped her with her suitcase earlier, she quickly noted. "I'm Arthur Rogers," he said. Her eyes immediately went to the red rose in his hand, and she knew that it was really him. "It's very nice to finally meet you, Miss Long." "It's nice to meet you too, Mr. Rogers," she said, her voice now much calmer. The first thing she noticed was that he didn't look like he was 40 years old. She'd expected to be met by a much older-looking man, but the one standing before her didn't look a day over 30 years old. He was more handsome than she had envisioned in her dreams, and she could hear her heart begin to beat fast in her chest as he stood there smiling at her. "You must be tired after the long journey. Would you like to freshen up first, and then later we can have something to eat?" he asked. He could see that she was shy and very unsure of herself. "Yes, I'd like that," she answered, avoiding his eyes as best as she could. "I have prepared a room for you at the boarding house. Let me help you with this," he said as he picked up her suitcase and led her back down the street. "What do you think?" Arthur asked when he opened Elizabeth's room and ushered her inside. "I like it very much, thank you," she answered as she stepped in and looked around. It was sparsely but tastefully furnished, and it smelled clean and fresh. She couldn't remember the last time she had such a pleasant room, all to herself. "I'm glad you like it. Please settle in. I will be back in an hour, and we can go to eat then," he said as he walked out and closed the door behind him. Elizabeth freshened up the best she could at the small wash basin and then changed into a clean dress. She brushed her long dark hair until it fell softly on her shoulders as she admired her reflection in the mirror hanging on the wall. A few minutes later, a knock sounded at the door, and she went to open it. He was lost for words when he saw how fresh and beautiful she looked. "Are you ready?" he asked after he'd recovered from his shock. "Yes," she answered. "Okay, let's go," he said. She stepped out of the room, and he carefully locked the door behind her. "How do you like Nebraska this far?" Arthur asked as they waited for their food at the small restaurant across the street. "It's different from Missouri," she said, and then her voice trailed off. He reached across the table and took her hand in his. It was warm and soft, and he gave it a gentle squeeze. "I'm very happy that you're here." "I'm delighted to be here as well," she answered. She let him hold her hand for a little bit longer, and he took that opportunity to study the woman sitting across from him. She was strikingly beautiful, but seemed unaware of it. She was clumsy, almost to a fault, and she didn't speak unless spoken to first. He attributed most of her behavior to her being very young and naive. Hopefully, she'd become more comfortable with him as time went by. The waiter brought their food, and they ate in silence for a while. "I was thinking we should get married this Friday. In the meantime, you'll stay at the boarding house. I hope you won't get too lonely there," he said. "That's okay. I will be fine until then," she answered, and this time she managed to look him in the eyes. She was beginning to warm up to him, and he was elated. "I have a few things to attend to before that day," he said, and she nodded her understanding. They finished eating, and he escorted her back to her room, bid her good evening, and promised to be back in the morning so they could have breakfast together. As he walked back to his office, Arthur thought about his fiancée. She was very easy on the eye, but there was a look of sadness etched deep in her eyes. He hoped she would one day open up to him. Elizabeth tossed and turned in her bed as she listened to people walking past her door toward their rooms. She was finally here in Nebraska, and Arthur was more than she could have imagined. He was very handsome, and she wondered why it had taken him 40 years to get married. He'd so far treated her with respect, something that she had never experienced in her life before. Still, there was a possibility that all this could blow up in her face one day. The secret she kept weighed heavily on her. She would wait until after they were married to reveal to him that she was illiterate and the reasons behind it. Hopefully, he will understand and not judge her too harshly. Chapter 17. They got married that Friday in a small ceremony, attended by Arthur's close friends as well as his employees, who were like family to him. As they stood before the priest about to exchange their vows, Arthur felt sadness overcome him as he looked at the empty seat he'd reserved for his friend, Chad. He had sent a couple of errand boys to Chad's house to let him know that he was warmly welcome to the wedding, but he hadn't heard anything back from him. He'd hoped that Chad would arrive at his house that morning, before the wedding, but he hadn't. "Mr. Rogers?" the priest called a second time, and Arthur came out of his trance to find Elizabeth staring strangely at him. "Take your bride's hand," the priest repeated, and Arthur did as asked, his attention now fully on his beautiful bride. They exchanged their vows without interruption, and when he looked back at the guests, he was pleasantly surprised to see Chad sitting in his seat, smiling happily at the newlyweds. The ceremony was over shortly afterwards, and the guests were free to leave at their own convenience. Those who could were to go to Arthur's house, where a sumptuous buffet awaited them. As soon as they arrived at the house, Arthur gently pulled his wife to the side. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said excitedly. "Who's it?" she asked. Arthur then waved at a gentleman who was walking towards the front porch. The gentleman spotted Arthur, and he began walking towards them. As he came closer, Elizabeth thought he looked familiar, and as he came closer, she realized it was the kind gentleman who'd helped her with her suitcase when she'd first arrived in Lincoln. "Elizabeth, I want you to meet my best friend, Chad Wheeler." Arthur began, but he was thrown for a loop when he saw his wife and his friends smiling happily at each other. "Have you two met?" "Yes, we have," they both answered. Elizabeth then narrated to him how she and Chad met and the kindness he'd shown her. "What do you know? It's a small world after all," Arthur exclaimed. "Thank you, Chad, for being here. I thought you wouldn't show up." I wouldn't have missed your wedding for anything. Congratulations, he said, and it was as if nothing had been wrong between them. The honeymoon phase passed, and Elizabeth started adjusting to being married and to life in Nebraska as well. She had all she had ever wanted, a beautiful house and a loving husband who heeded her every beck and call. Honey, there's something I want us to talk about after dinner, Arthur said one evening when he arrived home. Okay, Elizabeth answered, but her mind was racing. What did he want to talk about? Was he in trouble? After dinner, as they sat by the fireplace, Arthur took his wife's hand in his and cleared his throat. How would you feel if I asked you to come and work with me at the boarding house? He asked. I would love that. I get bored sometimes being here alone, she answered, her eyes lighting up. He was surprised as he hadn't expected her to be this excited about working. I'm glad to hear that. From tomorrow, you'll be in charge of bookkeeping at the boarding house. You're my wife and the only person I can trust wholly, he said, but he was shocked when the excitement suddenly vanished from her face. I'd rather do something else like cleaning, she said, as she wriggled her hands nervously on her lap. Why? You're my life partner. I can't have you cleaning with the rest of the workers. Come on, Arthur said, not quite understanding why she'd want to be a cleaner. There's something I've been keeping from you. I can't read or write, she mumbled, and her husband thought he'd heard her wrong. I beg your pardon, he asked. I can neither read nor write, she said, this time more clearly. Hinyung. That's not possible. We both wrote letters to each other for months, he said, clearly at a loss about what was going on. I didn't write the letters or read them. Someone else did it for me, she said, and the fury she saw in his eyes shook her to the core. What did I keep stressing to you in all my letters? I dislike liars and cheats, Elizabeth. Why would you do this to me? He thundered. He banged his full mug of coffee on the floor, and the contents flew into the fire and instantly put it out. Listen, it wasn't like that. I had a good friend help me is all, she cried, but he was too far gone to listen. Someone else read my most inner thoughts and desires that were only meant for your eyes. You, in turn, had a right to me. I never was in communication with you, was I? He bellowed, and the hurt in his voice broke Elizabeth's heart. I'm sorry, honey. Please let me explain, she begged to no avail. You've betrayed me, Elizabeth. I wish I never married you, he said and stood up. He hesitated for just a second as if he wanted to tell her something, but then he changed his mind and walked away. That night was the worst for Elizabeth. The pain and heartbreak she felt was like nothing she had experienced before. Not even Aunt Norma could come close. She'd spent the night alone, shivering by the fireplace. The following morning, Arthur had left the house without uttering a word to her. What she had feared had happened, and there was nothing else she could do. She had to leave this house and never come back. Chapter 18. Elizabeth listened as the young man promised her that the job he was offering her was real, and all she had to do was to go with him to where the job was. She had been sleeping in a run-down hotel on the outskirts of Lincoln, as that was the only place she could afford. It now seemed as if this young man was her knight in shining armor, and she had no choice but to take him up on his offer. All right, let's go, she answered, and the young man quickly helped her onto his cart. You've made the right choice, miss. My name is Chuck, he said as the cart lurched forward, and they were soon riding down the rough, dusty path at high speed. Arthur's heart dropped to his stomach as soon as he finished reading the note. It had been delivered earlier that morning by a strange errand boy he hadn't seen before. His former protege Chuck had his wife and was holding her hostage. She would be killed if Arthur failed to pay the ransom Chuck was asking for. He knew better than to try and rescue her alone and decided to consult with Chad. I knew this boy was a bandit. We will inform the sheriff's office first, and then we will assemble a posse and we will go out to find her, Chad comforted his friend. It's my fault, Chad. I was very mean to her, and now she's in danger. I will never forgive myself if something bad happens to her. He sobbed as his friend did his best to console him. Elizabeth tried to see through the blindfold, but she couldn't see anything. She had no idea how long she'd been held captive, and she was worried that she would never make it out alive. She had been wrong to trust a stranger, especially one that was holding such a bitter grudge against her husband. Her husband, did he care or even know how much danger she was in? She didn't think so. The last time they'd spoken, he'd made it clear that he no longer cared for her. She curled into a ball on the cold, dusty floor and cried her eyes out. It was late in the night when the leader of the posse spotted the dilapidated shed where Chuck claimed to be holding Elizabeth. They had to be careful with the operation, as they didn't want to hurt Elizabeth during the rescue. They surrounded it, and when the leader gave the sign, the entire posse burst into the room, their flashlights lighting up the dark shed in an instant. "Don't move, you swine," the deputy ordered as Chuck made as if to dash out. He'd been sleeping and had been caught completely unawares. "She's over there. Someone quick, carry her out of here," the leader directed. Arthur, who'd been quiet all this time, leaped forward and scooped his wife in his arms. She was very weak and kept drifting in and out of consciousness. "Arthur, you came for me," she whispered as tears ran down her cheeks. Arthur wiped them away with the sleeve of his shirt and kissed her dry lips. "Yes, honey, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me," he pleaded earnestly as tears pooled in his own eyes. "It's okay. Take me home," she answered before drifting back into unconsciousness. Arthur tried to speak, but no words came out. He was taking her home just like she'd requested, and he would never let her out of his sight again. Epilogue. Elizabeth stood back and admired the building that she had put up with the help of her husband to get the final coat of paint. "It looks very good, Mrs. Rogers, doesn't it?" Gabe, one of the painters, said proudly as he stood next to Elizabeth looking at the building. "Yes, Gabe, I must say it does look better than I had expected," she replied. "Your students will now have a comfortable and peaceful place for learning," Gabe said. "Yes, Gabe, and you must bring little Jean to begin her schooling," she said. Jean was Gabe's 5-year-old daughter, and Elizabeth had a very soft for her. The little girl reminded Elizabeth of when she was 5 years old herself. "Of course, ma'am, Jean will be here on Monday," he replied. "I see Mr. Rogers' cart coming down the hill. I will leave you two to talk." "Darling, I can't believe how far you've come. You have now opened your own school. No child in this town will suffer what you had to go through," Arthur said as he stood proudly by his wife's side. "I couldn't have done it without your help," Elizabeth answered as she leaned in for a kiss. After being rescued from captivity, Elizabeth had taken time off to recuperate, and then she'd enrolled in school to become a teacher. Now she'd opened her own school, and the sky was the limit. Chuck was where he belonged, in jail for the rest of his life. He had tried to beg for mercy on his day of capture, but Arthur was adamant that what he had done to Elizabeth was unforgivable. "Do you think now would be the perfect time to start our family?" Arthur asked. "Yes, there is nothing else holding us back," she answered. "I agree. I know you'll make a wonderful mother to our children," he said. "I know they will have a wonderful father as well," she replied and laid her head on his chest. They stood like that for a while, listening to each other's heartbeat. They knew that nothing was ever going to separate them again.